Today, we're talking about assassins and crit. As you guys know, I wanted to make more guides for builds in regards to assassins for a long time. The problem is that every assassin is pretty much different in that regard. But I figured that crit is something that is shared among a few assassins in different regards, and I would just like to address that as a whole and talk about which assassins can make great use of crit, which assassins can make use of crit but don't necessarily have to, and which assassins have a very niche scenario when it comes to crit, which can apply but is rarely even used. Let's first look at Serqet and Mercury. Both of these have a built-in crit in their kit, meaning they have an ability that can crit. In Serqet, it's her dash. In Mercury's regard, it is his ranged ability, his ranged poke ability. And both of these are kind of dependent on crit. The point here is that in both cases, the ability that we're talking about is one of their core damaging abilities. Mercury, it's basically his bread and butter. He will always use Made You Look to poke, to get kills on targets that are too far away otherwise and stuff like that. For Serqet, it's similar. While her highest secure damage comes from her ultimate Last Breath, Deathbane allows for very, very high crits, as it can crit up to 3 times, and as such is definitely one of her 2 core damaging abilities, which you can use a lot more often than her ultimate, so overall it definitely makes sense to go for crit there. In regards to which crit item is best for them, in the case of Mercury, it really doesn't matter all too much. Every crit item has its own viability in his regard, depending on how your playstyle is. There's none that is really, really bad for him. I would recommend Wind Demon most of the time simply because it has that extra bonus that benefits his passive, and it overall amplifies his abilities a lot, but every crit item does work. For Serqet, it's different. Rage doesn't stack on her 1, so I definitely would not recommend building Rage. Generally, with Serqet, you want to focus on those who increase the burst on her 1 by the maximum potential. As such, the best crit item for her is Deathbringer, and more often than not, that's sufficient in regards to crit items. Otherwise, I would say go for Malice. If you really, really want to, you can go for Poison Star or Wind Demon, but I generally think that the best items for her are those who deal more damage, as she doesn't really need additional slows or higher mobility. And with that, we're moving on to those who get extra benefits from crit, but don't necessarily have to build into crit. The 2 characters here are Zha and Hun Batz. Now, this may surprise quite a few people, because a lot of people think that those characters have to be built with crit, simply because they have crit in their passive or abilities in one way or the other. Let me tell you that this is absolutely not the case. We've seen this plenty of times in the SPL now, and overall, I've tried out myself often enough to say that crit on both Zha and Hun Batz is not necessary for them to function effectively. You have to keep in mind that a lot of their damage still comes from abilities, and abilities generally benefit more from penetration, or from power even. As such, there are a lot of item choices that just help more in specific situations. Crit is very, very expensive. It is great for what it offers. It has a ridiculous amount of damage compared to any other item, but it's not the most cost efficient you can go with your build. It doesn't bring you any high value until late game, where you often have more than 1 crit item, whereas Pen becomes effective immediately, and the earlier you get it, the better it is. If anything, both characters want crit to amplify their burst, so if you have a last slot and you're not sure what to build, I would recommend building crit in that place, but I wouldn't rush crit necessarily. Sometimes it can be good, and if you're ahead and you can afford it, sure, why not? But overall, it's not nearly as crucial to the character's function as many people think it is. In the case of Zha, I would always recommend building Deathbringer if you want crit, simply because it procs on all the hits of his ultimate, and Malice would lose some dot damage over time. Also, the initial burst that you can get with this is extremely strong on this sash as well. With Hun Batz, I would generally recommend Deathbringer as well. You can make evenly well use of Malice, but I feel like more often than not you want some extra burst on that character. So while in DPS Malice is higher, the initial burst from Deathbringer will always be higher, and as such I would probably favor it most of the time. A character that is generally not built with crit, but can benefit from it in very specific circumstances, is Nemesis. Nemesis has a specific build which allows you to go into crit instead of building kin size, going for attack cancels with a 3. You've maybe seen Adapting do this, he does this very efficiently, but generally it's relatively hard to pull off, and in many scenarios you will be better off simply going into Concise, which gives you a relatively good value for a relatively low price compared to Crit, which is a lot more dependent on you succeeding and it gives you a lot less room for defensive items. So in other words, it can be done on Nemesis if you know exactly what you're doing and the composition allows for it, but it's a bit of a complex field compared to other characters like Serqet or Mercury, where it's a lot more obvious. Then there's the category of those who Crit can be used on, and a lot of people tend to do so, but it's hardly ever really efficient unless you know exactly why you're doing it, compared to Nemesis, where there is a certain logic behind it. These characters just benefit from Crit as it gives you most DPS late game, and that's really the only goal you're building it on those, and as such is very, very overvalued in many scenarios. Those characters are Arachne, Awilish, Bakasura, Kali, and Loki. Now, why those characters? Arachne has her attack speed steroid, so does Awilish, and as such, Crit gives them a certain benefit in that regard. It's not great, but in addition with the power they usually build into and the steroids they're getting overall, it can be decent. Bakasura is one of those choices where you really have to consider why you're doing it. Bakasura benefits a lot from certain protection shredding items, certain pen items and all of that, and Concise just works a lot better with those. On top of that, at least until a certain point, until he reaches near cap with his passive, he wants to have a lot of attack speed, simply because it allows him to hit more procs with a 3, meaning he deals more true damage, which is a lot more crucial for the character than Crit. True damage and Crit don't have any interaction in that regard, so in that case, you're just giving up some benefits. There are those niche options where you can go for example, Wind Demon plus Rage or something like that, just to maximize your Crit, but often you want some defense on the character as well, and their Crit just falls short simply because it always takes up 2 slots to be really effective. With Kali, we're in a similar place. I did use Wind Demon as a last slot item sometimes, but more often than not, I felt like I'd rather have some other utility item instead that helps me more overall than that. It can be done, but you don't want to build into Crit too much, and especially on Kali, with her hit chain, you definitely want to make sure to have Concise first. Same goes for Loki. You don't want to have Concise on him, obviously, but he has that hit chain would theoretically allow for Crit, and I have made a build that worked with a certain technique of attack cancelling that's no longer in the game now. As such, there is the option, if you really want to go full on trade with Loki at all times, you could go double Crit in the last slots, but overall, most of the time, Pen will give you a lot more for the team, for split pushing and all that stuff, so it's not really that beneficial. We're coming down to the final few. There are a few guards where you maybe have seen Crit on, but it really, really, really rarely makes sense. In this category are Fenrir, Ratatoskr, Susano, Thanatos, and Thor. They all somewhat benefit from pen and power and stuff like that, so it may seem logical to some to clean that off with a last slot Crit item. I would almost always recommend against it. It just doesn't really fit their kits, it doesn't fit their playstyles. Yes, you're gonna hit some basics in between, but more often than not, you have another role late game where you're more of a frontliner, where you need some defense, and you need all those other items for the Crit to even work to some extent. So, yeah, it is theoretically possible, the items are available, but the scenarios where you actually want to build them are very, very, very rare. Thor being maybe the one out of those where Crit is the most justifiable still, along with Fenrir, but really there are no scenarios where I would find an absolute real reason to build Crit over anything else. And then, as the last slot, there is Beset. And if you are building Crit on Beset, then you should probably reconsider your choices because it is not very good. Beset gets in and out of fights way too quick to be efficient with Crit, as well as benefiting from penetration and power more all the way into late game because of her cats, and also not having that role of being a team fighter late game that is gonna go for basic attacks against the backline or something all that much. Maybe 1 or 2 hits, and that's pretty much about it most of the time. So don't build Crit on Beset. That's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope this was interesting and helpful. Thank you guys for watching. See you all tomorrow. Duke Sloth. out.